So let's begin by thinking about what is working memory. Well, working memory is one of many different memory systems that we have. And in fact, when we're talking about working memory, we're actually talking about holding on to information just for a few seconds at a time. It refers to the information that you can hold in mind in the here and now. When information goes into working memory and you're trying to remember it, you will only hold on to it for a few seconds unless you do something to try and help yourself to remember it. So a nice example of when you use your working memory is when somebody gives you, for example, a postcode. So if somebody said to you, well, my postcode is CB27EF, you would use your working memory to try to remember that postcode. And unless you'd started to rehearse it and say it to yourself, you would forget that information almost immediately. And that's because working memory only holds on to information for a few seconds unless we do something to keep it active and to hold on to it. So it's our working memory that allows us to hold on to information in the here and now, but it's not just about holding on to and remembering information. It's about being able to process and use that information in the course of any ongoing mental activity that you're engaged in. So we use working memory a bit like a mental workspace. We use it in many different aspects of our everyday lives and everyday functioning. So for example, if you're following directions, if somebody says to you, oh, to find the lecture theatre, you want to go down this corridor, take the second right, and then it's on the third left. Your working memory would kick into action and help you to rehearse and remember those directions. And at the same time, you would be processing the information as you followed the directions to get to your destination. So you're processing and storing information simultaneously. You're using this mental workspace. We also know we use working memory in the course of carrying out mental arithmetic. So the process of, for example, adding two numbers together, you're using working memory to retain the problem information. You're processing that information to work out the answer. Maybe on the way you're storing some interim totals. All the time you're using working memory, processing and storing information in the here and now. And we also use working memory when we're reading. So working memory enables us to remember the words that we're reading and to be able to integrate them to form a sentence that we can comprehend and understand. And in this way, working memory also interacts with long-term memory to aid comprehension. And I'll come back to speak a little more about the specific role of working memory in learning a bit later on. Now, what we know about working memory is that it has a limited capacity. So what this means is that there is actually a finite amount of information that we can hold in mind at any given time. And of course that makes sense. We couldn't hold on to every single thing that we hear all the time. We typically would say that working memory capacity is limited in terms of time, a few seconds, unless we start rehearsing the information to keep it active. Or we would say it would be limited in terms of the number of items that we can remember. So if somebody was to give you their postcode that has 7 items in it, so the letters and numbers, there are 7 of them to remember, that's the average capacity for an adult. We can all remember about 7 items in order before we start to forget them. But what we know is that working memory capacity varies greatly between individuals. So some people in the room here will have much larger working memory capacities and be able to remember more information than others, and some will have smaller working memory capacities. And it will be the children who have small working memory capacities who I'll be focusing on in today's talk. When we lose information from working memory, because it's only held there in a very fragile and temporary state, often when we lose information or we forget information from working memory, it results in catastrophic loss. So that means it's incredibly difficult to reinstate or recall something that has gone from working memory. Now, there are a number of different theoretical models of working memory, and I don't want to spend too long getting into this, but it is quite important when we think about the different roles that working memory plays in supporting different types of learning. So up here, I've just got a very simple depiction of working memory. So working memory and short-term memory are terms that are used interchangeably. In a very popular working memory model that we tend to work within in Europe, we consider there to be a verbal short-term memory system. Now, this part of working memory allows you to recall and remember anything that you've either heard or that you've seen written down. So anything that's verbal, you can take it into mind and you can repeat it back exactly as you heard it or as you read it. We have a similar system for non-verbal information, which we call the visuospatial short-term memory. Some people call it the visuospatial sketchpad. So these two systems are about retaining information and recalling it exactly as you heard it or as you saw it. And you might use your visuospatial system for trying to remember, for example, a route on a map. And then we have our working memory system. So this is the component of working memory, which is like the control center. So it allows us to use information that's stored either in verbal or visuospatial short-term memory, and then we can use it in some way to process that information. And then this system also interacts with long-term memory, so you can use information held in mind now with information stored in your long-term memory. So this is just one very simple depiction of working memory. When I talk about working memory, I'm referring to how it interacts with the short-term memory systems and also into long-term memory as well. So the capacity of working memory, the amount of information that you can hold in mind, it increases with age. So when we're born, we have very, very small working memory capacities, and we see dramatic increases, particularly across the primary school years. And in fact, what we see is that even within an age group, there are huge individual differences and variations in working memory abilities. So on this graph here, we've got age along the bottom, so children aged 5 through to 15. And here we've got scores on a working memory test. Now this line here shows you the average performance for children of particular ages. And what you can hopefully see is that this line is increasing over time, so as children get older, their working memory capacity is developing and increasing, meaning they can remember more information. But you can see here that these lines are actually showing you the spread of performance for each particular age. So in a classroom, you could be working with a group of children aged 8, and their typical performance would be around here. But within that same classroom, you're going to have children whose working memory capacities are actually equivalent to children who are aged 13. So they are able to remember much more information than many of the other children in the class. And you'll also have children whose performance is down here. So these children will actually be performing at the level of a typical 5-year-old. So what you might find is that the average 8-year-old can remember 4 or 5 things at a time. But that child who's got poor working memory, the child who's sitting at the bottom of the graph here, they'll have a working memory capacity that means that they can only remember 1 or 2 things at any particular time. So if you think about the demands in the classroom of having to remember information, if you're the child who's at the bottom here, who's performing on average 3 years below the other children, you're able to remember far less information than the other children in the classroom. Hopefully you can already start to think about the kinds of challenges that you might face. So I'll be focusing on the children here who have working memory problems. But what we also know is that we see deficits in working memory. So we see that children who have small working memory capacities are highly represented when we look at different developmental groups. So if we're working with children with ADHD, what we'll see is that often many children who have attention deficit disorder will also have poor working memory. We know that children who've got reading difficulties, specific language impairment, dyslexia, and Down syndrome are really characterized by having severe problems in verbal working memory. Whereas children who've got mathematical problems and who have Williams syndrome, they tend to be characterized by having more severe deficits in non-verbal or visuospatial aspects of working memory. So what we can see is that working memory problems are common. We know that there are in every class of 30 children, there will on average be 3 or 4 children who have working memory difficulties. We also know that working memory problems are a common feature of many different developmental disorders that impact on learning. So this really brings me to thinking about, well, why is it that there's a close link between working memory and learning? Why do we see that working memory, for example, is linked to school performance? Well, over many years, we've carried out lots of different studies where we've looked at the association between performance on working memory assessments and children's standardized academic attainment here in the UK. And I'm just going to show you a snapshot of some studies where we've seen that working memory ability is linked to children's performance and their academic performance when they first start school, and that we can use it to predict how well they're going to do as they progress through primary and secondary school. So here's an example of a study that we carried out over 10 years ago now. In this particular study, we were working up in the northeast of England, in Durham, and there they had baseline assessments. So these assessments were given to children when they first started in reception class, when they were 4 or 5 years old, and they asked the teachers to rate the children's ability as they started school on measures of reading, writing, and mathematics. We went into the schools and we assessed children's performance on a range of working memory assessments. And what we saw was a very strong association between performance on these assessments and the children's working memory abilities. We also found that performance on these working memory tests when the children started school, so when they started in reception, they were excellent predictors of English and maths performance at the end of Key Stage 1. So in other words, you could use these working memory assessments as a child started school to predict where they're likely to end up when they do their standardized assessments 2 years later. So we can use working memory tasks or tests as a prospective indicator of academic performance. We've seen a very similar pattern at different ages. So here we've got data from 11-year-olds. So in the UK, this is the final year of primary school. And here we actually categorised children based on their Key Stage 2 performance according to whether they were below national standards, at the average level expected for their age, or whether they were above average. And we categorised them into these 3 groups based on their English attainment, and we also did the same based on their maths attainment. And we measured their performance on working memory tasks. Now, the assessments that we use are standardised working memory tests. So what this means is that typical performance should be at 100, so it's a bit like an IQ test. Anything of 85 or below would suggest that there is a working memory impairment or a deficit in working memory, meaning the child is unable to hold on to as much information at any given time as the other children in their class. So hopefully what you can see quite clearly on the graph here is that children whose English attainment levels were below national expected levels, they had poor working memory. Those whose English performance was where we would expect relative to national levels, their working memory abilities were bang on where we would predict for their age. And those who were above average in English were also above average in terms of working memory. We saw exactly the same pattern with mathematics, but here the deficit in working memory was more pronounced in those who were scoring below nationally expected levels for maths. We've also replicated this finding at Key Stage 3. So here we were looking at children's performance in English, maths, and in science, and we saw the same strong links. So those children who struggled in terms of English, maths, or science seemed to have working memory problems. So this data tends to be pointing toward a strong association between working memory and learning. So why is it that working memory might be important for learning? How do we use this memory system to support the learning that goes on or supports the processes that enable us to learn? Well, there have been many different studies in this area, and one of the key studies looking at working memory and reading comprehension suggests that within the working memory system, we use the verbal short-term memory storage system, or the phonological loop, along with the attentional, executive control demands of working memory that enable us to complete reading comprehension. So what we tend to do is use the verbal short-term memory system to hold on to the words and sentences that we're reading, and then we use our working memory to process those words, to form them into meaningful sentences, and then working memory will interact with long-term memory and with our long-term knowledge to enable us to comprehend the text that we're reading. So when we're engaging in reading, it's really the verbal aspects of short-term memory and working memory that work in tandem to enable us to hold on to information, integrate information across sentences and across paragraphs so that we can build up a representation and comprehension of what we're engaged with in terms of reading material. When we think about working memory and maths, what we see is actually that it's the visuospatial or the non-verbal aspects of working memory that are important. So if you think about engaging in maths, although you might remember the problem information verbally, there is some kind of mental or visual representation that you generally have to be able to carry out any kind of mental arithmetic or mathematical operation. And in fact, what studies have shown is that we tend to use our visuospatial short-term memory system when we're trying to solve maths problems. And again, this interacts with our processing system in working memory, and it interacts with long-term memory to enable us to actually retrieve information such as arithmetic facts that we have stored in long-term memory. So reading relies predominantly on verbal aspects of working memory, maths more on the non-verbal aspects of working memory. When we think about language learning, what we can see is that the system that is most important, both for first and native language learning, as well as for second and third language learning, is the verbal short-term memory or phonological loop system. And the reason that this part of working memory is so important is that it is the system that allows us to maintain an internal representation of a new sound or a new word. So whenever we're starting to learn any language, when we hear that unfamiliar sound, that unfamiliar word, the information is processed and it's immediately stored in verbal short-term memory. And then what will happen is the verbal short-term memory system will kick in to enable you to rehearse that information, and then you can actually start to integrate it into long-term memory so that it becomes a word that you know and understand, and it will do that by passing through the working memory system here. So what we know is that children, for example, who have phonological loop or verbal short-term memory problems will typically be delayed in terms of language learning and language development. Okay, so we know that working memory is related to learning, and in many studies that we'd carried out, we started to say, well, we see these strong associations between working memory and learning. And in delivering lots of talks to educational practitioners and teachers, we were often then asked, well, how am I going to spot a child who's got poor working memory when I'm in the classroom? I don't have ready access to the kinds of tests that you use. So what things will I be looking for to identify this child with problems? So we carried out a number of studies where we went into schools and we were observing children who had poor working memory. And in these studies, we had people who didn't know which children had working memory problems and which children didn't have working memory problems. And we asked them to actually to go in, observe two different groups of children. Then we got all the ratings back and all the observations back, and we collated it together. And we actually identified some key characteristics of children who had working memory problems. So unsurprisingly, one of the hallmark features of children who have working memory difficulties is typically that they are struggling at school. In fact, when we have worked with over 300 children with working memory problems, we've seen that more than 80% are typically struggling in both reading and in maths. In terms of their social integration, we see that children with working memory problems tend to be quite reserved when they're in a group, but they do tend to have a small number of friends. So they're not completely socially isolated. Here I've got a description of a child called Ross. He was a 6-year-old with working memory problems. And here's some of the key characteristics associated with the social profile of a child with poor working memory are really highlighted quite well. So Ross was reserved and quiet. He tended not to volunteer responses, and he rarely answered direct questions, particularly in the whole class situation. Well, if you imagine that poor Ross has got a very poor working memory, he can really only remember one or two things at a time. If a teacher's asking a question to the whole class, it's incredibly unlikely that Ross will be the child to put his hand up to give you an answer. And it's not because he doesn't understand, it just may well be that he's forgotten the question that you've asked him. We also see here that Ross becomes more vocal sometimes when he's working in a small group, but he isn't necessarily discussing the task at hand. And this really strikes with another key feature of children with poor working memory. So what we often see is that their behaviour will be quite off-task. They're quite easily distracted. And again, this comes down to them forgetting what they're meant to be doing. So children with poor working memory will quite easily forget the goals of a learning activity. They'll forget what they've been asked to do. So then their behaviour becomes highly distractible and they start to behave in a way that's off-task. We also see that children with poor working memory find it incredibly difficult to follow multi-step instructions. So as we all know, in the learning environment, typically, children will be given multiple steps of an activity to carry out, or there'll be multiple steps of a classroom management instruction. And what we know is that children with working memory problems will typically do either the first thing on the list or the last thing on the list. And this is exemplified quite nicely here by a small child called John. So the teacher asked him to put his sheets on the green table, his arrow cards in the packet, put his pencil away, and come and sit on the carpet. So that instruction sequence contained 4 things to remember. And when we observe John in the classroom, what we see is that he did the very first thing. He moved his sheets as he was requested to do, but he failed to do anything else. And when he realized that the rest of the class was sat on the carpet, he joined them, but he missed out the intermediate steps of that instruction sequence. So what you can see here is that the memory demands, the working memory demands of this instruction sequence were just too high. There were too many things for him to remember. And what you might find in the classroom is that John did the first thing, and then he might have wandered around aimlessly, or he might have started to distract other children, because he didn't really know what he was meant to be doing. He had forgotten. And then when he saw what everybody else was doing, he simply joined in at the end. We also see there are particular classroom activities that are really challenging for children with working memory difficulties. And hopefully, if I've described working memory well enough to you, you'll understand that any problem that involves processing and storing information at the same time is going to be really challenging. So here we've got an example of such an activity, which is trying to identify the missing numbers in a number sequence. So here the numbers were written on the board. There was a number sequence. There were gaps in the sequence. And the child with poor working memory really struggled to identify what the missing numbers were. And if you think about the working memory demands of this activity, having to remember the numbers that are there, having to work out what the gaps are between the numbers so you know how the number sequence is progressing and changing, then having to retain that information, think about your numbers and your long-term number knowledge to draw out the answer. There's a lot of information you're holding on to. The number sequence, where the gaps are, how the numbers are progressing, and you're having to process what you know about numbers from long-term memory to be able to work out the answer. So activities like this, that might seem relatively trivial because there is a lot of information presented for the child, actually the working memory demands can be surprisingly high. And this is also exemplified when you look at children's written work. So children with working memory problems find it particularly difficult to keep track of their place in written work. So here the child had to copy down the date and the title of the piece of work from the board. So all the information they had to remember was written in front of them. But the working memory demands of this activity came in reading the information on the board, tracking down to the page, engaging in the laborious process of trying to write, so remembering all the rules of spelling and grammar, and then tracking back up to the board to see what the next letter or the next word is. So that keeping track of their place, on top of doing the actual writing, produces incredibly high working memory demands. So what you can see here is that this child, Nathan, he was asked to write down the date, Monday the 11th of November, and underneath the title, which was the market. He lost his place when he was going backwards and forwards between the board and his written work, and he ended up writing Mona Market. So he probably got the M and the O from Monday. He knew it was an N next, but he tracked back up to this N in November, so we ended up with a capital. Not sure quite where he got the E from, but he must have thought it was this one, and then he wrote down the word market. So what you might see is that children with poor working memory have real problems trying to retain information from one piece of paper to another or from the board to the written page, because the attempt to keep track of where they are can place high demands on the working memory system. We also see that children with poor working memory tend to present in the classroom as though they have short attention spans and as though they're highly distractible. So when we have in the past spoken to teachers and said, "Oh, how does this child come across to you?" the kinds of things that we often hear are, "Well, he's in a world of his own. He doesn't listen to a word I say. She's always daydreaming. With him, it's in one ear and out the other." And that's kind of true. It goes into working memory and straight out again. The child forgets what you've said. It isn't necessarily they haven't been paying attention, it's that they seem to have forgotten the information. So what we know is that children with poor working memory might actually present as though they are children who are a bit like children with ADHD. And in fact, you might think that when you read this about Adam. So he struggled to maintain attention, particularly during the whole class situation when the pupils were joined together on the carpet. He was always told to come and sit directly in front of the teacher. He was prompted to sit correctly and pay attention because he was fidgeting all the time. And he was also looking around the classroom and distracting other children who were near him. So you can see he's fidgety, he's not paying attention, he's distracting other children. He might present as though he's someone who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, in fact, we carried out a number of studies to investigate this. And what we saw, actually, on the whole, was that children who have poor working memory, they do have high levels of inattention. So they find it hard to stay on task. They find it hard to stay focused. And that's very similar to children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But in fact, what we find is that when you compare the behavioural profiles of those with poor working memory and those with ADHD, the children with ADHD are far more hyperactive and oppositional. So they have many more outward signs of disruptive behaviour and of hyperactive behaviour. However, we do see that they both have impairments in working memory and inattention. So there are some similarities between the groups and some differences. So why is it that children with poor working memory struggle with learning? Well, what we suspect is that the classroom environment places many heavy demands on a child's working memory system. We know that learning is an incremental process that happens step by step. So what will typically happen is, in a particular lesson, you'll set some activities for the child to complete. And you hope that these activities will help them to acquire knowledge relative to the subject you're teaching. And we actually rely on children completing those learning activities successfully to be able to acquire the knowledge in one lesson that might then be built on in a subsequent lesson. So you have a series of activities that over time enable a child to build up their knowledge. Now, what we know about children with poor working memory is that they really struggle with each of these learning tasks in the classroom, often because the working memory demands are just too high. There's too much information to remember. So what happens is they forget that information, they abandon the tasks that you set them, or they don't complete them successfully. And what this means is that over time they experience frequent lost learning opportunities, and they start to fall further and further behind. And over time this will manifest as slow educational progress. So what can you do to help these children? Well, there are two different approaches that have been used quite widely. One of them relies on actually providing classroom support. So in other words, in trying to think about restructuring the environment around the child to reduce the working memory demands to enable them to complete more learning tasks. And the second approach comes down to working memory training. So this approach involves trying to directly train and improve a child's working memory capacity. So what I'm going to do is just spend a bit of time talking about the two different approaches and try and bring you up to speed with what the literature is showing us to date. So I'll start with the classroom-based approach. So this really evolved in about 2003 and 2004, and we were doing lots of work with children who had working memory difficulties. And teachers were asking us, well, how could you actually help these children in the classroom? We know why they're struggling. We know the working memory demands of the classroom are often too high. At the time, we thought, well, we know you can't train working memory directly, so let's think about coming up with an intervention that enables teachers to reduce the working memory demands of the learning activities that they're setting. And I always feel when I start to talk about this intervention that I should really emphasize that this intervention approach is not rocket science. It builds on elements of good teaching practice. But the real key thing here is to think about how you would deliver a lesson to a child who can only remember two things at a time. And if you think about that and apply the principles and restructure learning activities for that particular child, then you increase their chances of success. So the intervention itself, it was all about reducing working memory overload and about applying principles of good teaching practice specifically to children who have working memory problems. So we designed an intervention and we trialled it in different schools up in the northeast of England. So we had a set of schools who carried out this intervention. We had a set of schools in which the teachers were providing more one-on-one direct supervision time with the children with working memory difficulties. And we had another set of schools who had no intervention. So it was a three-armed intervention trial. For the schools who were carrying out the working memory intervention, we taught teachers how to be aware of the signs of working memory failure. So really telling them about the characteristics of children with poor working memory that I've described to you today. We suggested they monitor the child to make sure that these warning signs of working memory problems are present in different subjects, maybe with different people, to make sure that it wasn't anything subject-specific. And then to think about the activities they were going to set for the lesson and to apply some simple principles. So when you're designing your lesson, thinking about the lesson plan, just think about trying to reduce how much information the child's got to remember on their own. So there are ways of doing this. You can have the key bits of information written down on a piece of paper next to the child with working memory problems. You might have the key steps of an activity listed on a board. Related to this, try to reduce the difficulty of the processing. So if it is a multi-step task, break it down for the child who's got poor working memory. Maybe start by giving them the whole class, all of the instructions, all of the steps of this complex activity. But for the child with poor working memory, maybe deliver the instructions one bit at a time, or get them to sit next to somebody who can help them through the different steps of the activity. So just thinking of ways of making it less complex, less information to process and store. We also encourage teachers to create a classroom environment in which they were happy to re-present information. So creating and fostering an environment where it was okay for the child to put their hand up for the 10th time and say, oh, I've forgotten the next step. And that's quite challenging and quite difficult, but it's something that then will foster an environment where a child can tell you if they've forgotten, rather than just sitting there and not finishing the task. We encourage them to use memory aids, both the children and the teachers. But there was a caveat here. If you're using a memory aid and putting something on the desk near the child to help them in the lesson, make sure you don't put too many things on the desk, because that in itself will create a memory demand of what thing have I got to use next. So using things that are really relevant and salient to the activity. And then the final thing was really to help the child to use strategies. So firstly, making the child aware that they have a problem remembering more than one or two things, and working with them to think about how they might improve that ability. What might they do to help themselves? And so we found that a lot of children would like to have some kind of device to record what the teacher was saying. Then they could play it back at a pace that suited them. And all the information was then stored there, so they didn't have to rely on working memory. Other children used personal dictionaries for words that were particularly hard to spell, to reduce the processing needs of spelling, to help them focus on the task at hand. So we got schools to carry out this intervention across one academic year. And what we found is that the teachers said it was a relatively easy intervention to implement, that in fact they could use this intervention alongside existing curriculum activities. They also found it was beneficial to realise the child was struggling due to forgetting rather than not paying attention and being deliberately disobedient. And they also found that the children were much more successful and had improved self-esteem because they were completing more of the activities in the classroom. So it created a better sense of achievement and self-esteem for these children who were struggling. And we found that we monitored the fidelity, so how often did the teachers adhere to this intervention? And we found that that fidelity rating was actually highly related to increased success across the academic year in reading and maths for the children who were in this intervention. So if you want to know more about this, we have published a paper that describes the outcomes of the trial. We have got a book as well, and in this book that's written by Sue Gathercole, it describes some very nice concrete examples of how to implement this intervention. But if you don't want to pay for it, we do have on our CALM website, which I'll put up at the end, a free downloadable PDF, which you can print out yourselves and use to think about the kinds of activities that you're running in the classroom and how you might restructure them. So that is freely available on our website, so I'll make sure you can access that at the end. Okay, so let's think about the alternative approach. So this one involves changing the environment around the child. The other approach involves trying to improve children's working memory directly. So how many of you in the room have heard of working memory training or CogMed or any other kind of intervention? Okay, a few of you, that doesn't surprise me. Okay. So these kinds of interventions came about in about 2002, 2003. And the idea is that you get children to practice on working memory tasks, but they're on a computer and they're embedded within a game environment. Now, historically, people had tried to train working memory. So back in 1982, there was a really famous study where they were trying to improve somebody's digit span. So they were trying to train this person to remember more than 7 items or 7 digits without forgetting them. And they actually managed, over the course of a couple of months, to train this person to remember over 100 digits in order. And then they got him to try and remember letters. And his performance for remembering letters wasn't improved. So he could remember more and more digits because he'd trained on remembering a series of digits, but it didn't transfer to being able to recall more letters. And when they asked him how he was performing the number task, he said, well, I wasn't remembering 100 numbers. I'm actually a marathon runner, so I chunked that information into marathon running times. So I was just remembering a smaller series of running times and combining those numbers into groups to make it easy to remember. So he was using a strategy, and he couldn't transfer that strategy to be able to remember letters. So on the basis of this, for many years, we always believed you couldn't train working memory, or that if you did, you get better on what you practiced, but there would be no transfer to any other kind of activity or task. So when these studies came out in 2002, 2003, they were promising the world. They were saying that, you get children to train on a working memory task. So, for example, here, they have to remember a set of numbers and click them in backward order on the keypad. Or you'd have these asteroids floating around in space, lighting up one at a time. The child clicks on them in the order in which they lit up, and then they blow up at the end. So if you get a child to train on these, give them a training of about 25 sessions over 6 to 8 weeks, to get them to train for about 15 hours. And what you'll see is improvements in working memory. And for children with ADHD, you'll see that their levels of inattentive behavior will reduce. They'll be better able to pay attention. And they said the key to these tasks was that they're adaptive. So that means that, for example, if a child's working on a task where they have to remember 2 or 3 items, as they get better, they suddenly have to remember 4 items, 5 items, 6 items, and so on. However, when they start to fail, the tasks adapt back down again. So they're always pushing the child to work at their maximum capacity, but they're adapting back down again so the child doesn't feel disheartened or disillusioned. So there were some really promising results with the early studies. And in fact, in some of our own studies, we used a program like CogMed, and we found that after 6 months of training, you did get a small improvement in some children's maths performance. So these early studies were really promising, and we thought, well, maybe it is that you can train working memory this way. However, we're now kind of 10 years on from these early studies, and in fact, what we found when we used these very kind of rigid and rigorous randomized controlled trials to assess whether or not these are beneficial interventions, in fact, what we see is exactly what those early studies showed. You see improvements on the tasks on which children train, and also on very similar tasks, but you don't see improvements in terms of everyday abilities. So here, this is some data from a large randomized control trial that we ran. In this particular study, we had children who were assigned to the adaptive training group, so they were training on those computerized tasks that were getting increasingly difficult. We had children assigned to a placebo group, so their training did not get more difficult. It was just a low dose throughout the 6 to 8 weeks. And then we had a group of children who had no intervention at all. And we assessed these children before and after their training, and a year later, on a whole range of working memory tasks, and on 17 different measures of learning and classroom performance. So here we've got gains on the untrained working memory tasks. So these were not tasks they trained on, but they were similar to the tasks they trained on. And the bigger the bar, the greater the improvement. So hopefully you can see that for verbal short-term memory, the training gains were relatively similar across the 3 groups. There were no differences. So really, if you trained or had no intervention, there's no difference to your scores on that particular test. However, we did see that adaptive training made you better than the other groups in terms of visuospatial short-term memory and both verbal and visuospatial working memory. So there were improvements on working memory tasks that were not trained. However, there were no improvements on any of the other measures that we took. So we took a whole range of measures of spelling, of reading, of maths, of children's ability to pay attention in the class, to follow teacher instructions. There were no improvements either immediately after the training or a year later, suggesting that the effects of training are actually very, very limited. We've got some colleagues who've been very interested in looking at whether or not training actually does anything to the brain. I've got a colleague, Duncan Astle, who carried out a similar study to the one I've just described to you, but here he was looking at connections between different parts of the brain. And what he found, in fact, was that as the children's memory scores improved, there were increased signs of connections between the frontal parts of the brain that are associated with paying attention and with the visual parts of the brain that are associated with where you might direct your visual attention. So it suggests that you do get better on working memory tasks. There might be some changes in the brain, so you might have faster connections between parts of the brain following training, but actually, this doesn't really mean anything unless you get real-world benefits. And in fact, what we've seen is that there are no reliable benefits following training for reading, for maths, for attentional symptoms of ADHD, or for IQ. So there might be something happening, but it's very, very specific to the kinds of things children train on. So we could give up on training altogether. We might think, well, it might be doing something, but it's probably just making you better at what you're practicing on. Or we could use training to start saying, well, maybe it's enabling children, for example, to develop strategies to be able to remember more information. But what we need to do is take training a bit further, rather than just carrying out training alone. So at the moment, children just sit on a computer for 6 to 8 weeks, an hour a day, doing their training. Then they go back to the classroom. And we think they're not transferring anything they're doing in training back to that classroom environment. And in fact, what we might need to do is firstly make the training activities themselves more relevant to classroom learning. So train children how to use and expand their working memory in classroom-based activities. And we might also need to firstly make them aware of the kinds of strategies they might be developing to remember more information, and then get them to practice applying those in different situations back in the classroom. Okay, so I've got about 10 minutes left. What I've been doing so far is really focusing on working memory, because that has been the focus of most of my research. But I think what we need to do is be really aware that there are many other cognitive abilities that are important for learning. So I'm going to take the last sort of 5-10 minutes to tell you a bit about the more recent research that we've been carrying out at the Centre for Attention, Learning and Memory, which is based here in Cambridge. So we're really interested, quite broadly, in understanding why some children struggle to learn. And my particular focus has been on trying to understand how working memory impacts on learning, why working memory constrains children's ability to learn. But like most people and like most of the research in this area, we've been working with very, very specific groups. So for example, many studies will work with a particular group of children with a specific diagnosis. So for example, children with ADHD or children with working memory problems. Or they'll go out into the clinical or community settings, so going to schools, and selecting children with really specific profiles of problems. So for example, selecting children with reading difficulties who don't have maths problems. So you end up with a very rarefied, specialized group. Or studies focus on just one particular cognitive domain, such as working memory, which is very much what I've done in my research up to this point. And although these studies have taught us some important things about why children might struggle to learn, there are some limitations. The first is that they assume that all the children in a particular diagnostic group are the same as one another. So the assumption is, for example, children who've got ADHD, they've been given that diagnostic label. The assumption is, well, every child with ADHD will have the same kinds of behavior problems and cognitive problems. And of course, what we know is that that isn't true. You can have two children with ADHD who can be entirely different to one another, can have very different symptoms. You can have the one child who's more driven, more kind of acts as if they're driven by a motor, is hyperactive, on the go all the time. Or you might have the child with ADHD who's far more daydreamy, inattentive, looking out of the window. So the assumption of many of the previous studies is that actually children with a disorder all have the same symptoms, but we know that's not true in reality. It also makes the assumptions that if you're comparing groups, for example, children with ADHD compared to children with dyslexia, it makes the assumptions that those two groups are quite distinct, and there is something fundamentally different between those groups. And again, of course, we know that's not true. So you might have children with ADHD who are highly inattentive and who struggle to read. In the same way, you'll have children with dyslexia who are struggling to read and are highly inattentive. So the assumption that these groups are separate is somewhat misleading. And we know, actually, that if we really want to fundamentally try and understand why children struggle to learn, we probably need to move away from just studying specific groups. And that's what we've tried to do through the Centre for Attention, Learning and Memory. So we've tried to understand what causes learning problems in the common struggling learner in the classroom. This child often has complex learning needs. They often have co-occurring symptoms and difficulties. So we opened the Centre for Attention, Learning and Memory, which has the really nice acronym of CALM. If you come in, it is anything but calm. We opened the clinic in September 2014, and we have assessed 750 children so far. So we've recruited the children from educational and health practitioners. So we're asking speech and language therapists, SENCOs, educational psychologists, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists to refer to us any child who has a difficulty with attention, with learning, or with memory. And we don't care whether they've got a diagnosis or not. If they have, fine. If they've got more than one diagnosis, fine. If they're just struggling, and you can see they're struggling, but they don't have a diagnosis, then they can still come to the clinic. And what we do is we assess cognition, so we assess working memory and lots of other cognitive skills. We assess learning. We put the children in the MRI scanner, which we fortunately have at the bottom of the garden. Most people have sheds. We have the MRI scanner. And we also take a saliva sample so that we can look at the genetic links with learning outcomes as well. And the big questions we're asking are, what dimensions of cognition, learning, behavior, and brain structure distinguish these children? So in other words, if you look at children who've got different kinds of learning profiles, how do their cognitive abilities compare? How does their brain structure differ? And how do they differ genetically? So it's a really big, ambitious project. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that we're doing, so the assessments with the children take between 4 and 5 hours. They come into the clinic. We get them to complete a whole range of cognitive tasks, looking at attention, memory, executive functions, phonological processing, processing speed, nonverbal reasoning, and working memory. We get their parents to complete a number of behavior ratings. So we look at how they use their executive functions in everyday life. We have ratings of ADHD-like symptoms, we have ratings of communication skills, and we also get ratings from both parents and children about mental health. So we get ratings of anxiety and depression. In terms of the brain, we actually bring the children in for what we would call a structural brain scan. So they're asked to lie in the brain scanner with their eyes closed, and they spend about 30 minutes in total, and we have a different set of scans that we take. And this allows us to see grey matter and white matter, but it also allows us to look at connectivity in the brain. So how well connected are different areas of the brain? And then, as I say, we get the children to spit in a pot at the end of the assessment, which they will really enjoy. And that allows us to then send that off to Adam Brooks, and we store the information there. And hopefully, over time, we'll be able to look at genetic links to learning. So we are about, I don't know, halfway through running the clinic now. We're going to go up to about 1,000 children in total. What we've started to see is that children's phonological abilities are highly related to language and literacy learning. So that's probably not too surprising, but it's interesting this has been shown in typical samples. Here we've got a really mixed group of children who are struggling to learn, and you see these very strong links here. We see that children's executive, working memory, and spatial abilities are highly linked to their learning outcomes, and they're also very predictive of children having problems paying attention. So executive working memory problems might be expressed as inattentive behavior in the classroom and as having specific problems with maths. We've also started to identify this very strong link between having high levels of hyperactivity, so not being able to sit still, being fidgety, alongside social pragmatic communication problems. So when I'm talking about pragmatic communication problems, it's really about how well a child is able to apply social rules in communication. So an example of when you use your pragmatic communication skills might be when you're at the checkout in a supermarket and the sales assistant says to you, "Oh, how are you today?" You'll use your social rules to say, "I'm fine, thank you," and then you carry on. Because you know in that situation they don't really want to know how you are that day. They don't care if you had a sleepless night, you need coffee, you're hot. So it's about understanding the social rules. So I'm sitting here now, my pragmatic communication skills are telling me you're all very hot, it's the end of the day, you want me to wrap up. which is what I'll do. Okay, so bringing everything together, hopefully today I've been able to talk to you a bit about how poor working memory might put a child at risk of falling behind at school. Our research has shown us that classroom management can be very effective if you apply the principles, so if you try to reduce working memory demands. We know that intensive training is not very effective as it stands, but we might be able to take it further and to use it as a tool with which to teach children or make them aware of the kinds of strategies they could use to try to remember more information. And hopefully just in the last bit that I've told you about the clinic, hopefully I've started to emphasize that we do need to start thinking about other cognitive abilities. We also need to give some serious thought to what diagnostic labels mean. So when we look at these kind of children we've seen in the CALM clinic, we see profiles of learning problems that are completely unrelated to the diagnosis the child has. So here we're starting to think, well, do we need to step back and consider more what's going on at the cognitive level to be able to design effective interventions? So thank you very much for listening to me. Here's my email address, and there's more information about the CALM clinic at this website. And on there is a tab for resources where you'll be able to download that booklet about how to help children with working memory problems in the classroom. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.